Is there any thought process for someone trying to implement that this year of what they need to do about shifting cameras and really trying to, whether cutting tracks or what would you tell them to do if they don't have that past experience about shifting those cameras and getting back with a cutover kind of habitat area?
I mean, they're going to, it seems like when they get into that hard horn, they start cutting those corners. They start cutting the corners of the SMZs. They start cutting the corners of those cutovers, just like they're going to do once you get into the rut. Like they're still, their mindset is heading toward that. So I mean, our farm has had cutovers before, multiples SMZs in it, and tons of edges and stuff. And they start hammering those corners. Anywhere you can get a corner that cuts an SMZ, they're going to be in that. And habitat diversions, like if you're switching from that SMZ right into the cutover, they'll be floating along that edge somewhere, so I'm going to look at the edges of those hard edges in that type of area, SMZs, and especially if you get them where you do have the isolated white oaks, isolated food sources like that are in those, because that's what you see in the SMZs a lot of times are those white oaks that are choked up in the bottom, and especially if they're in that super thick stuff. Now if that SMZ dumps out into open hardwood, they're probably going to be in that, but I'm going to look at that super thick head of that SMZ. If it's rocky or something like that's what I'm looking for.
One just came to mind. I got a spot that sets up exactly the way you say. It's kind of like those head of those SMZs, those drainages. Again, stream side management zones. We've got, what was the episode?
Oh, gosh.
Can you look it up real quick? What's the episode we did on the terminology? I've been recommending to everybody. Again, because we got a lot of terminology in this episode people may not be familiar with if they're new. But the head of those SMZs, when they've it's almost like they feather out into a clear cut. Mm-hmm. It's very rare you get to the head of SMZ or a corner of a clear cut, and it's like hard timber next to like the pines next to the hardwoods. It's always like that corner's always kind of feathered edge. Which episode?
580. Episode 580.
Ultimate Guide to Whitetail Terminology, I think it's called. Episode 580. Go check it out. But it's like those corners are always kind of feathered. Like you always get there and it's like just brushy. Like for whatever reason, the pines don't grow very good in the corners when they try to plant them. So it's always like a feathered edge. The head of the drainages are always a feathered edge. And when I say feathered, it goes from like kind of open hardwoods to brush to like grasses into the clear cut over. It might be 10 yards, it might be 40 yards. It's like that or longer. And there's an SMZ I'm thinking of right now that is really close to where I shot one of my bucks, and it sets up exactly like that. And it's rocky, and it's just like all the brush is like chest high going all the way up into that clear cut, and then it's just a wall of thick pines.
We Pablo last year, he was having trouble finding deer. Like he just messaged me several times. He's like, I can't. I don't know what the signs. I just can't. Don't know what I'm looking at. So I sent him into a place that had a pretty fresh cutover. I said, go up in these SMZs, and they're just like that. They're not super steep or anything like that, but it's open. I said, don't pay attention to the open hardwood. I said, but keep going till you get up in that thicker. I said, you'll see sign. I said, it'll start picking up when it starts getting thick and thick and thick. And sure enough, I said, go in there and look at all those SMZs and kind of try to break down how you think they're using them. So he called me like the next day. He's like, I cannot believe the amount of sign that I've seen in those. I've never paid attention to those before. I've just been hunting, the open like feed areas, And he said, I busted out 3 or 4 does. He went in there a couple days later and hunted, and he's like, I approached it from the wrong way, blew out a bunch of deer, But I think it clicked a light on for him,
I got another one of these SMZs just like this. That remember that time I walked in Andrew to that spot? I blew it. I walked right through the bedding cover. This big loop.
Well, the spot I told you to go to?
Yeah. And
I pinned a spot for him, and he went out of his way to walk through the bedding area to get to the spot.
I'll walk through part of a clear cut. Clear cut, is real big and wide, and there's like 3 SMZs. And I went from one SMZ, crossed over through the cut, got into the next SMZ, and then worked it up. But that next SMZ up, it transitioned from, again, those open woods to it was this thick brush in there, and that's like where all the big buck tracks. And that's what I was going to say. There wasn't any rubs. It was kind of early bow season. There wasn't any big rubs in that spot quite yet. Or maybe it was a gun hunt. I can't remember.
No, it was a gun hunt because you were trying to hunt the head of it.
That's
and
right.
Watch up into the cut.
But it was like...
Hey, that area is probably prime.
It probably
right
is
now.
primo, but it sets up like what you're talking about, where you didn't see any sign in the open hardwoods, and the second you hit, there was like a transition between like as you went up that drainage, the SMZ, where it went from open to a wall of cover, and you're navigating through it, and it's just big buck tracks over buck tracks crossing it, going back and forth, coming from one side of the cut to the next side of the cut. I don't know if we've really ever covered that a whole bunch on the podcast, looking at the very tips of these SMZs, where
I
it
don't
really,
think so.
yeah, where it gets really thick, and I think that's going to be a tip. Probably listeners, if you go out there and implement it, probably have a lot of
and
success.
he's like, what are they doing in there? I was like, I said, that buck is just going at the head of that drainage and just bedding right there. I said, he's basically on an island where he can see in multiple directions and escape before. I mean, you'd have no clue he was there. You'd probably walk. First off, most people ain't gonna walk up in there, so he's probably never been bumped there before. So that's why he's using it, and he's just going up in there bedding. Soon as the thermals drop, sun goes down, he's back to his route. But he may stay up in there all afternoon.
It's just like that Auburn buck, the Auburn study buck. Do you remember it?
Yeah.
I think that's more like one of the only times we've gone over it was the one where he was bedded up at the head of the draw.
Yep.
And actually, I think you were the one that pointed it out about him bedding in all those draws up next to the road.
Yeah, he bedded consistently, and there was one draw that he bedded in a lot, but he liked bedding in that kind of spot, and he had like 9 different beds, quote unquote, that he was using, and it was always he liked getting like at the very very tip of that SMZ, like as soon as it peters out, and a lot of times that was right next to that road. And he would be within 40 yards of a road consistently bedding during the daytime. On a WMA, in an area we're familiar with.
Open, where they had just cut it, wasn't a tree on it, brush, there wasn't anything. It was wide open. And that buck was just bedded right there, Now, I mean, again, we don't know. I had that buck going up in that drainage 11 times during the daylight in October, November time period. So, I mean, he had nowhere else to go. So he was definitely using that drainage to bed up in a lot. There's just no way to escape it, So.
Well, and we're kind of getting back on the trail camera topic. That's like another really good spot where you could, if you have, and this is a conversation I want to get into, like for the guy that has like, 5 cameras versus the guy that has 10, 15, 20 cameras or more, the strategy. But like that's almost like something like you find an area that you really like. And especially if you're putting cameras out right now, maybe get your battery groups. And the second, if you're in that more kind of clear cut habitat we're talking about here with SMZs, pine thickets and stuff, once they disappear, instantly go to those closest spots, like whether it's 100 yards away, 200 yards away, and drop cameras at the head of all those SMZs, those drainages. Because it seems like when you do get to those spots, it's a lot of that perpendicular travel crossing the tips of those things, and also like you said, beds there, but it always seems like they're just working through that thicker cover.
Yeah, I mean, you get a lot of cross traffic of does just crossing that. So I mean, it's almost like a buck can cut a bunch of trails right there during any time, and he's gone like 300 yards maybe, if that.